The aviation industry is seeing more and more people transitioning into second careers as pilots, controllers, mechanics, and even content creators. So where did they come from? What were they doing before? What made them realize and chase their dreams? We find that out right here on Fly the Transition. Welcome back to a brand new episode of Fly the Transition, where we explore the journey of those making the leap into a new career in aviation. I am your host, Jim Schilling. Thank you so much for joining me. In this mini episode, it is time for an update. I'll answer the obvious question, where did this podcast go? What have I been up to? And most importantly, what is in store for the future for the podcast and a relaunch coming soon? It's time to welcome you all back to Fly the Transition. Well, it has been entirely too long since there's been an episode of this podcast, and I promise there's good reason for it. This will be a relatively short episode as I just give an update on how things have been going, where we went in the first place, and kind of what I've been working on for not just this podcast, the other podcasts, and, well, life. So, starting off, where did Fly the Transition go? I had published 7 episodes of the podcast. I actually have 2 episodes that I recorded and have never edited or released at this point just because, well, life. My real job got awfully hectic. At home, we started working into dance season for my daughter. Not for me. No one on earth wants to see that. So it's preteen competitive dance. I'm sure you can imagine those of you who have kids or have had kids in dance. That is an all-consuming activity for my daughter. She dances like, I made the joke, 8 days a week, kind of the reference to that Beatles song. But she is at the dance studio all the time, running her back and forth. And then there's the competitions that take up weekend time, and I was doing my fatherly duties as a prop dad, running props onto the stage for different dance routines, things like that. So I don't want this to sound like I'm complaining. It was an absolute blast, and watching her do what she loves is really cool. So that was a big part of where I've been hanging out. And when it came time for aviation stuff, I just didn't have time to run both the Fly the Transition podcast and the Flying Midwest podcast, and work on my own ratings, which includes starting work on my CFI rating, which has been an awful lot of fun, but is currently also on hold because of, well, a school of work that was dedicated for 10 weeks. I'm about 5.5 weeks into that program right now. So once I graduate from that, that is one more thing off the table, and I will go back to working on my CFI work. But even my CFI rating has been put on hold for a short amount of time. So let's talk about the Flying Midwest podcast, which is one of the other big time-consuming things that I had that pulled me away from this podcast. The Flying Midwest podcast isn't all just about me. That is a 3-person team that came together to make that podcast possible. Lots of great guests that we were able to bring into the picture. And that in and of itself was a lot of work, and there's other people in that realm that depended on me. So in that space, this podcast took a back burner, though it has remained as a spot that I really, really wanted to explore and bring back again, because I got a lot of great feedback for Fly the Transition. I think that the concept is something that people can really relate to, as there are so many people that are trying to make that switch into a career in aviation, whether it be flying, A&P work, or what have you. There's just a lot of people that are moving towards a dream job as opposed to just a job that is going to help them pay the bills. So throughout the summer with the Flying Midwest podcast, we did a ton of interviews leading up to Oshkosh, as well as at Oshkosh itself. That was a whole journey in of itself, where Maddie and I were able to go to AirVenture Media Credentials. We were there for most of the week, and we were doing several interviews a day to try to build up some good content. And it is frankly a target-rich environment for collecting great aviation content. Another thing that I haven't done that I really need to do is I took hundreds of pictures at Oshkosh, and though I've weeded out some of the ones that are, you got the motion blur because you got fast aircraft moving, things like that, I've got, again, hundreds of pictures that I still have to go through and edit and get out into my social media stuff. And my guess is by the time I get to it, we'll be looking at AirVenture 2024. So stay tuned for those photos. I will get those edited, just as soon as AirVenture comes around again. So after we had all these episodes from AirVenture, it came down to the task of not just editing episodes audio-wise, but we had a lot of video content that we took as well, and that took a lot of time to edit too. So more than likely, we'll stick to the audio realm just because editing video is so much more time-consuming, and it's not that I can't do it, it's just that for the sake of my own sanity, for my family's sanity, and for pushing out the content that I want to push out, I think the audio form is where I need to stay to be able to put that stuff out there. That, and then you don't have to see my face. So the next thing I ended up doing is working with an editor to actually help us edit the Flying Midwest podcast. Admittedly, for me, part of the joy of podcasting, as lame as that sounds, is the editing process itself. One of my outlets in my personal life to relieve stress, things like that, are just creative outlets. So to be able to put together the pieces of an episode from raw audio files and the snippets of the intros and the outros and put it all together into a finished product is really rewarding for me. So admittedly, I had a bit of a hard time letting go of part of that creative process, but we were really fortunate to have a listener of the podcast reach out who does some freelancing editing work through a company that she runs called Crooked Larch. Her name is Janelle, and she has been helping with some of the episodes of the Flying Midwest podcast. And the really cool thing is not only with her having listened to the podcast before, but also enjoying aviation content, it helps to kind of segue what our vision is for the podcast and helping her come up with a really good final product as well. I'm willing to guess that those of you that are listeners to the Flying Midwest podcast, you probably haven't even noticed a difference in whether it's me editing or it's Janelle. So she does really great work, and she's been able to help free up some of my time to work towards bringing this podcast back. So now we know where Fly the Transition went. It's not like it's completely vanished as something that I have a passion for. Again, like I said, it's something that I think is a really great topic, and I'm really excited to see where this podcast is going to go in the future now that I'm able to maybe dedicate a little bit more time to it. That said, I want to change the format of the podcast a little bit. The first 7 interviews that I did for Fly the Transition, I did more of a narrative format over the interviews to try to do it as like a storytelling type of vibe for the episodes. So there would be me talking a little bit, and then we would jump into like a descriptor interview portion where the guest would talk about the certain thing that I had just led into. I found out that takes an awful lot of time to not just record that and edit it, but writing the scripts for it, going through and breaking up the interviews. And I think that for the sake of still making sure that we get this great content out there in terms of these interviews, I think we could just let the interviews stand for themselves. So that is a change you can see coming with Fly the Transition as we move forward into that new space. So speaking of new, if you are listening to this podcast right now, it's for one of two reasons. Either you listened before, you subscribed, and you see that it's back, and you're like, oh, great, new episodes, and you want to hear what's going on. Or you've seen some of the posts that I put up in some of the social media groups looking for guests to move into 2024. If that's the case, welcome to Fly the Transition. I'm so glad that you're here to see what it's all about and get an update on what's coming in the future. Stick around for the next few minutes or so while I give a description on what's happening next with the podcast itself and what you can look forward to with the relaunch that's coming up. So first thing I'll say about this relaunch is I did go on to several social media groups that I'm a part of on mostly Facebook, but I've also done some on some other forums. But the response that I got just asking for people who would be interested in sharing their story of changing to a second career in aviation was incredible. Frankly, overwhelming. I got so many responses that it took me the better part of a day just to wade through the responses to the posts themselves, the different messages I'm getting on like messenger platforms, things like that. And it's just now, after about 24 hours of putting this out here, that I'm starting to feel comfortable with getting organized, getting the information that I need put together into some sort of format that makes sense for me to be able to put these interviews and episodes together. I saw many of you out there who are really interested in hearing about this topic, maybe in the space of something that you want to do, something you wish you could do, or just hearing the stories of those who have taken that leap into the new journey themselves. So I hope that the hype will be lived up to as we put those interviews together. Now, as for the responses themselves, there is such a wide variety of backgrounds that people have come from and places that they've gone in aviation that I think we've got a really robust amount of topics that we'll be able to cover to keep things interesting over the course of the podcast itself. Even if there's some similar topics, I think that people's various personal experiences will still make it worthwhile to listen. For example, in getting responses back, I've noticed a couple of common themes for where people have come from before going into a career in aviation, and there's quite a few different arenas of public safety that's in there between fire service and EMS and law enforcement. And then the other one that is on the higher side of people is people that have come from an IT background. So I found it really interesting that those areas stood out, and I'm curious to see where those stories will take us. Another common theme, obviously, is those who have gone from whatever career they came from and moved to an airline, whether it be regional or one of the majors. That is a theme that I see as well with a number of the guests. But again, I really think that their personal experiences and how they got there is just as important to the story as where they ended up. And even if one of those episodes or one of those different accounts of how people made their journey resonates with somebody, then I think that hearing those stories is totally worth it. So I think over time, we're going to hear obviously some similarities in people's paths to wherever they've landed in aviation. But overall, I think that it's still going to be really great to hear those different stories, the different challenges, pros and cons from their prior career, and even skills from those careers that really lend themselves to their career in aviation now. I think it's all going to be really interesting, and I hope that you'll think so too as those episodes start rolling out here and you take a listen. So I'm going to go back again just briefly on all the responses that I've gotten. First of all, thank you to everyone who's reached out and expressed an interest on being part of the podcast. There are some that I had to screen out just for the sake of there were so many responses, and I wanted to make sure that I was true to the concept and ideas of the podcast. So some had to be screened out, and some were even kind of put on hold until maybe a future date when things have developed more for them personally in their journey to be able to tell a more final story of that progress. That said, though, there are some that I intentionally picked out that are still in progress of going through their change from one career to another that I think hold a certain amount of benefit for the audience, as well as the opportunity to tell different phases of their story. So while you're in the thick of it and going through some of the challenges of making that leap into a new career, you may have a very different perspective than once you finally achieve your dream. And for those that are on the fence, I think that's a really important step to see what that looks like, so they really get a full grasp of what they could possibly expect too. So with all that said, are you ready for the maybe a little overwhelming part for me? Of the responses that I've looked at and screened in and have started to reach out to hopefully schedule interviews in the future, if all of those pan out, and even if no one else contacts me saying, I'd love to be on your podcast, I currently have enough people plugged into spots on my lead sheet to schedule interviews and publish a weekly podcast for the next year. So I've certainly got my work cut out for me. I don't know if it's going to actually be a weekly podcast. It's going to be something where as I get episodes created, we're just going to push them out. If it ends up being weekly, so be it. But I'm also not going to drive myself into the ground trying to work full time, spend time with my family, and produce 2 podcasts. So even all that said, I'm pretty excited that there's that many people that have reached out to me, expressing interest to allow me to tell their story. It is a really, really humbling moment for me to connect with each and every one of you that have expressed that interest. And I'm really, really looking forward to this journey and taking you all along with me. So in my final little moments of this state of the podcast update, that was super lame, but I'm going to leave it in here anyways. I am working on creating a formal relaunch of the podcast itself where we'll start putting out regular episodes again. I think about around 3 or 4 interviews that are already recorded, just need to be edited and put out into the world. And I've got a number of interviews coming up in the next couple weeks. So production of the relaunch is certainly well underway. As for the official date of the relaunch, stay tuned to my social media, which is going to be on Facebook at Fly the Transition. You can also check out the webpage for Flying Midwest Media, which is flyingmidwest.com, and just go to the tab for Fly the Transition. I'll put some updates on there as well. Or on my Instagram, you can check that out at Fly Midwest Gym. My original plan is this is going to relaunch in January of 24, but quite frankly, it will come down to if I have the patience to sit on the episodes, if I have them finished, or if I'm going to want to just hit the go button and throw it out into the world for everyone to hear. So certainly stay tuned. More information will be out in the near future on the official relaunch of the Fly the Transition podcast. So if you're itching to hear some of the content now, I've got 7 episodes already. You can go back and re-listen to the episodes we've got out there. And if you don't want to miss a moment, go ahead and subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast right now, and you'll get notifications when new episodes come out. My final thoughts, if you think that this podcast could be a benefit to someone else in making their decision or working through their transition to a new career in aviation, I certainly encourage you to share the podcast with them, have them reach out and ask any questions. I may not have the answers, but as I interview more and more people, I'm certain I'll be able to find some people to point them in the right direction too. So feel free to reach out on any of my social medias, or you can email me at flythetransition@gmail.com. So thanks once again for taking some time to listen to this update of the Fly the Transition podcast. I'm so excited for what the future holds, and I cannot wait to share it with all of you. So until then, and until I can come up with a catchy sign off for this podcast, we'll see you next time.